I'm here with Julian Burnside QC, who's the President of Liberty Victoria and author of the recent book Watching Brief. He's agreed to talk to us a little bit about what's going to happen next week, what's going to happen in the federal election 2007. Thank you for agreeing to do this.
No problem.
First, I wanted to ask you, what are the main issues that concern you in the lead up to this election and for the years to come in Australia?
Right at the moment, I think the big problems in Australia are our attitude to human rights and the way we've played out our attitude to human rights. Not many people need to be reminded that we lock up asylum seekers who've committed no offence. The present government actually argued for the right to lock up an asylum seeker for the rest of his life, even though he had not committed any offence and wasn't thought to be a risk to anyone. That strikes me as being an extraordinary attitude to human rights. Locking up an innocent person forever is pretty bad. Then the anti-terror legislation, although it's directed to a perfectly worthwhile end of reducing terrorism, has gone a few steps too far, I think, so that now it's possible for a person to be jailed for a fortnight without having committed an offence in a secret trial on evidence which that person is not allowed to know about. The first they know about it is when they are arrested and put in jail, and then specifically prohibited from knowing the evidence that was used against them. Likewise, control orders. You can be held under house arrest for 12 months without access to telephone or internet. That can be ordered in a secret hearing, which you don't know about until it's made, and when you're arrested and placed under house arrest, you're not allowed to know the evidence that was used against you. Now, to be able to have your liberty trashed as easily as that, in circumstances where you don't even know what's been said against you, is an extraordinary position to have reached. So I think the approach to human rights in Australia really needs a lot of work. The reason this has come about is that the government controls both houses of Parliament, and they have pushed through both houses legislation which I think has been a concern to anyone who's interested in human rights.
And do you actually think that these are issues that matter to mainstream Australians? I mean, a lot of people would accuse you of being a broken record on this stuff. I mean, why would you think that that is actually important for everyone? I mean, I'm not a terrorist or a refugee. Why would it bother me?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, there are plenty of instances of people in authority who make a mistake about someone, and the mistake is only revealed when you get to see the evidence they've used against you, and they say, no, hang on, that's not me, that's my twin, or that's not me, that's someone who looks like me. Here's my ticket to Sydney. I was in Sydney that day, I wasn't in Melbourne or wherever.
So there are a lot of mistakes made, and innocent people can get tied up in it very easily.
People make mistakes. Look, the last two Iraqis who were held on Nauru had been accepted by Australia as refugees, but refused refugee status, or rather refused protection in Australia, because ASIO had formed an adverse view of them on security grounds. ASIO will not say why, they will not say what facts they've taken into account. These guys were stuck on Nauru for 5 years, so don't know what sort of trouble they could have been in. Anyway, when this went to court, ASIO decided to go to Nauru and have another chat to these characters. Now, the way to go to Nauru is you go to Brisbane and from there to Honiara in the Solomon Islands and from there to Nauru. Well, the ASIO heroes chartered themselves a flight and had to spend 24 hours on the ground in Honiara because they'd forgotten to get Nauruan visas for themselves. Now, if they can make mistakes like that, then I guess they can make other mistakes as well. Since then, of course, they've actually changed their mind about one of them. They've decided that he's not a security risk. They won't say why they've changed their mind. Now, if people can make mistakes, then anyone whose liberty can be taken away with them not knowing the evidence faces a risk of being imprisoned unfairly, unreasonably. We know the Immigration Department has made mistakes in hundreds of cases. They've locked up people who are not meant to be locked up. Now, you can't take these things lightly. And frankly, the first time you will know whether these things matter is when you are the subject of injustice like that. And then what will you do? One of the things you'll do is you'll try and get legal help. Can you afford it? No, unless you're very rich. So what you trot off to legal aid. Legal aid will say, sorry, we can't aid things like this because our budget doesn't run to it. One of the big human rights problems in Australia today is that legal aid is so hopelessly underfunded that it is not available to most people except the very poor and those who are facing very serious criminal charges which they can't afford to defend. Now, what greater injustice than not being able to vindicate your legal rights?
And it also sounds from what you've said like there's a fairly significant problem of a lack of transparency as well through a lot of levels of the current government. So what do you think are some of the problems in the Australian democracy that have the potential to be fixed during this election?
I think the first step towards fixing some of these problems is to make sure that whichever party gets government does not control the Senate. You know, the two houses of Parliament have quite different roles. The government is the party which has a majority in the lower house, but the Senate represents the country on very different lines. It's supposed to be the state house of review. It represents the states rather than the people at large. And traditionally, the Senate has had a really important supervisory role. Since the present government got control of the Senate in July 2005, they have pushed through all sorts of legislation with no chance for proper debate.
Including work choices?
Including work choices, of course, and the anti-terror legislation, which was banged through despite the very clear misgivings that the minor parties had and the clear injustices that they thought these laws would produce. Now, you know, whether it's the Coalition or Labor who control the lower house after the election, it's really important that the minority parties have the balance of power in the Senate, because then the minority parties have the possibility of saying to the government, we will not pass it like this because you do not adequately protect human rights. And that's something that the Senate can do.
Okay. Now, you've mentioned briefly the different roles between the House of Representatives and the Senate. Did you want to speak more about that?
Well, I think, you know, people often don't understand the importance of the Senate because the lower house is the place where everyone looks. But the Senate really does have an important role in putting a check on what the government does so as to force the government to think more carefully about the legislation it's putting through. Now, ultimately, our constitutional arrangements are such that if the Senate keeps blocking legislation, there is a mechanism for resolving the deadlock, which ultimately will work for the government. But in the meantime, short of that measure, the Senate can force the lower house to think more carefully, and it has traditionally played a very important role in that. Some of the worst excesses of the worst legislation put through can be stopped if the lower house is not controlled by the government.
And one last question, which I have been asked a lot in the lead up to this election, and that is, why do you think that Labor has been so silent on issues of human rights? Dr. Hanif, and they seem to be, you know, supporting capital punishment in various situations. There hasn't been a lot of noise made by Labor in terms of improving Australia's human rights culture. Why would you think that is?
Sadly, I think that in Australia most people would say we think human rights matter, but if you ask a few more questions, it turns out that human rights matter for me and my family and my friends and people I like, but not really for people I'm afraid of or people I don't know or don't like. Now, that's just not an available position in human rights. If you're serious about human rights, that is just not an available position. But, you know, broadly speaking, in Australia, human rights have never been a major problem, at least for most people. Now, in times when the community is fearful of terrorism, for example, it's all too easy to fall into the thinking that if we make ourselves safe, then we don't have to worry about other people's human rights. And if you take this two-tiered approach to human rights, you're on a very dangerous path, because we know what happens when you say some of us are more human than others. But the point about human rights is that they're available to us not because we're nice people, but because we're human, all of us, even nasty people.
And do you think the Labor Party thinks that too?
I think the Labor Party has done their focus group research, and they have figured out that to take a strong stand on human rights right now will lose votes, which, if it's true, is the most powerful argument for having an independently controlled Senate that will argue for human rights. Because frankly, by the time your human rights are threatened and my human rights are threatened, the game is over. It's all too late. You need to stand up for human rights when unpopular minorities are being attacked. Don't wait until the majority is under threat.
Okay, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.